You're listening to a nerdy production. Warning, this is a nerdy production. Welcome to the GM Workshop. We want to dive into insight and tricks from game masters and game designers all over the world and digging up that tacit knowledge so we all can be better game masters and evolve the hobby we love so much. Reach out to us on the GM Workshop at Facebook, Twitter, and Discord, and subscribe to the podcast in any podcast app you are using. And now, on to today's episode. Roll for initiative. Welcome to GM Workshop. Today we are talking Symbaroum with Matthias. He is a primary game designer from Free League, and we want to dive into this wonderful setting and talk about all the nitty-gritty things in this setting. But first, as always, we have to introduce our guests. So, Matthias, can you tell the listeners where you come from role-playing-wise and what you are doing in this time and moment?
Yeah, hi. I'm a Swede from the very north of Scandinavia who has played role-playing games. I started pretty late, actually, at about 17 years old. This would be by the end of the 80s. And I started out playing mainly Swedish games such as Drakar och Demoner, Mutant, Shock, Western, and also a little bit later we played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu and all the big ones. So I mainly, you can say that from the age of 16, 17, role-playing game was how I associated with my peers, my friends. I played a little bit of hard rock drums as well, but role-playing games, I believe, is what has been most formative for me during those years.
Swedish black metal or something like that?
No, I actually, my brother-in-law is the drummer in Meshuggah.
Oh, nice. Cool.
Mattias Haake, yeah. So I'm only the second best drummer in the family nowadays since I'm married.
Yeah, that's fair. When you started up, you said Drakar and Demoner, or Drager og Demoner, Dragons and Demons.
Yeah.
It's a classic Swedish game which are laid surrounding the basic role-playing games and converted into D20 and back again, as I remember. It has a lot of conversion, but it was very hardcore in the deadliness in the system and not as hero focused as in Dungeons & Dragons, the Gygax systems and so on. And you said Western is also a pretty rough system to get shot in. It's not a fun experience for the players or the characters, especially.
You can say it's more real than fun.
Yes, for sure. And so you're from a background where more realistic or more deadly role-playing game are associated with your game style. And when you look at this, you often see storytelling evolves in different ways, where drama often isn't violence drama. Is this something that you have taken with you in furthermore into your role-playing career?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, one of the reasons why most people would describe Symbaroum as a pretty deadly or dangerous. It's dangerous to fight in Symbaroum, and the reason for that is not that we enjoy total party kills, but the hope that the player characters will try to find other ways to solve their dilemmas and challenges.
Yeah.
And not least through role-playing, and negotiating instead of fighting, for instance.
For sure.
So that is, I don't know if I understood your question correctly,
it's fine. As put link it into Symbaroum, of course, but when you look at systems between the Dragons and Demons and towards developing your own game, you put realism and deadliness in forefront and in your choices of games as a GM or as a player?
I don't know, not necessarily. There are different games for different occasions and for different groups that you play with. So I think I can enjoy other kinds of systems as well. Me and my long-time role-playing friends, we live scattered across basically the world today, and we get together once a year. And often then we, okay, I don't know if I should duck under the table from shame here, but often we play 5e because, you know, it's low effort, and it doesn't, you know, it doesn't force any kind of immersion on you. You can just sit back and play it almost like you play a board game.
Yeah, drink a beer, and use the escapism from the day-to-day.
You know, friends having fun together, and not much more than that. But if I get to choose what to both play and GM, I always, and also this is seen in the design of the games that we make. The Symbaroum team is much more of the target is immersion and player agency, rather than, you know, facing a series of single solution challenges and facing them all with the dice in hand.
And that's a pretty fun to. You defines the escapism versus the immersion in your own game, and then you put it into when you want to sell a game like Symbaroum. It's immersion that it's the important part of it. That's nice.
Oh yeah.
When you started up as a GM, you which system or which setting was it that you said, okay, this is the setting, this is the system I really like to tell stories in, and I can create something unique for my player group?
Back up a little bit, because my story as a role player begins very much like as a player. And over the course of the first 3 or 4 years, I did not GM very much. Once in a while, I took a stab at it, but I wasn't very good, and 2 of my other friends were, you know, much better. So a lot of my experience is in role playing comes from being a player, which I think is you know, has been really important for me also when designing and creating adventures for others to play. Because later on I always wanted to, you know, tell my own stories, so to speak, and when I finally did, I mostly went with the systems that I knew. So Drakar och Demoner was the premier one, absolutely, for a long time. And then, I don't know if you know the history, but in around the turn of the millennium, me and some friends started a hobby company called Järnringen, and created a new version of the mutant IP called Undergångens arvtagare, Heirs of Doom. So, and that was a really, really important school. And I don't know, I wrote this massive. I'm very much into designing massive campaigns, and the first one was for Undergångens arvtagare, for the mutant. And both of these games are, as you know, the systems are derived from basic role playing. So there are the percentages, there are quite deadly, not realistic per se, but they are crunchy, but not in you know, not in the or in the sense of Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, where you have these levels that you follow. It's much freer in terms of character creation and character development and so on. And that is also something I really, really enjoy as a player, and that I try to put into the games we make today.
The basic roleplay principles to make it a bit crunchy, bit realistic, and then take it from there, and don't stall too much when we play the stop and go thing.
But then I must add something that you must never forget when discussing your preferences in systems or settings or whatever as a GM or as a player is that what happens to a game when it hits the table is always something new. Because role players are, I mean, maybe not all, I don't know, but the ones I know are creative and they are rebellious. And if they don't like a set of rules or they don't like a specific setting, they rearrange it. They house rule.
Yes.
And we did a lot of that, which is also very, very important, a very important lesson that I try to make use of as a designer. The fact that, you know, try to design the games and the adventures and whatnot with the knowledge that this will be modeled or refurbished or tweaked by a game master, and not by one game master, by thousands of game masters, because we're so lucky we have a lot of players.
Yeah, for sure. It must be a hard thing to cope with as a game designer. Know that you are creating this game. This is the right way to play it, and then you sit it down with a test GM or a group you listen to on a podcast or whatever, and they just do something completely different in what you wanted to do. That has to be a hard thing to cope with in the beginning, I imagined.
Yeah, but luckily we had this experience during, you know, the around the turn of the millennium, the beginning of the 2000s, where we had this relatively small Swedish community of mutant players, where we learned this the hard way. And today it's just, I mean, it's just the way it is, and why shouldn't it be? It was exactly what we did when we, you know, read the Adventures of Dungeons and Dragons, or even Drakar och Demoner and so on. So that is what role players do, and that's one of the reasons why this hobby is so amazing.
We are.
You know, I often say that when I go around meeting people or meeting people like this, when I talk to you, it's not at conventions and such. I never meet consumers, which I did when I worked for a short while in the computer games industry. I meet co-producers, co-creators all the time, both players and GMs.
That's a great point to see that all of us, especially as always GMs, particularly, we are all game designers in some regards. We also want to change things. We also want to make our own stuff and so on and so on. So that's a great point to bring to the table, Matthias, for sure. When you play with your players as a GM, I know you like to be a player as well, but when you sit down with a group of players, how do you manage a table? If you want to play Symbaroum with let's see 4 new players this Saturday, how do you manage this?
Oh, this is a question that I really cannot answer because it hasn't happened. I only play with people I know, and I listen on a couple. I mean, there was a time when I GM'd a lot at conventions. And I don't think, and this was the 90s maybe, and I don't think me or anyone else was very aware at that time that you know, you should take a bit of time to discuss beforehand or get to know one another a little bit. It was more or less just okay, sit down, here is your character sheets and let's play. So today I would probably approach the situation very differently, depending on what game I was playing, of course.
You have a tendency to dark fantasy and horror, so there's a lot of issues in those in a group with players, and we often find themselves in a session 0 is a useful tool to find where the players are at in how much horror and how much terror we can affect on our players as a GM, and what is fun and what is not fun. But it's a great point, because back in the 90s, we had sometime we had the session 0, but that was primarily to define which one will take the cleric role or which one will take the mage role.
Exactly. Maybe create the characters
sure.
together. That was like maybe.
So it's a great point, because we have talked on this before in one of our Danish episodes, and he Ulrich has, as I talked to, just said it as plainly as he didn't know he was using a session 0 back then, but they did. And there's often talked about which kind of movie do we want to play? What kind of movie are we want to be actors in or experience? And that's I think that's a great way to approach a new game, to find out, because there's difference between playing classic Call of Cthulhu 1920 type and Actum Cthulhu, where it's more pulp and more action. So I think that's a great analogy to see which movie do you want to be in, and then of course going forward to talk about safety tools and so on. But it's in the which kind of movie are we want to play, which. So it's good. It's a great point, Matthias.
But that is also a thing that, when I don't mean to sound to insinuate that I'm in, you should feel sad for me, but I rarely have time to just open the rule book and with a couple of friends and sit down and play like that. It's almost always a question of play testing something that is already written. So then the session 0 becomes very much about, introducing the theme of the pre-written story. That of course will, evolve very differently depending on what the players do and how their characters react. But still, it is something different from.
As you are more focused.
I don't know what I'm going with this.
You want to point out that when you are playing in these times, it's mostly to test stuff and most to get very focused, and then you use your session 0 to make your players cope with the issue at hand and what you want to test or what you want to have focused on. So it's where you are in a bit of a different part of the gaming community than most of us are.
But I mean, one thing that I did learn very much during the years that I GM'd a lot is that you had a question for today, or a theme or a topic for discussion that was about play style, and what I learned is that it depends very much on the dynamics of the gaming group and the context. So for me personally, being a game master is very much about being, and this may sound, I don't know, boring, but being a servant to the players and to the story, being a facilitator, being, the engine that helps them. And the joy I feel as a GM is mostly, I find it in the eyes of the players. My fun is them having fun. But I know that there are almost as many GM styles as there are GMs out there, and very important to stress that the most important thing is that the GM adopts a style that works with the group of players that he or she has.
But still, we also have to remember that we as a GM also are a player, and it's something. Sometimes we miss that opportunity. I think into knowing this, and let the players know that we also are at the table to have fun. So it's a coherence, of finding the right story for the right players, for the right system and right setting, and so on and so on.
And then the players will, they will very much set the tone of how the story and the style develops during play. I had one very interesting experience. I think I must have been, say it's 25 years ago, and I was going to start playing with a completely new group of players. And we were having sort of a session 0. And during this, I proudly proclaimed that, I'm not that kind of GM that plays on feelings very much. For me, it's more about, tactics and politics and dice rolls, not very much on feelings. But since when we started playing, it was obvious to me that the players they wanted something else, and they took the story in a way. I don't know, there were people crying from joy and from sadness and angst and whatnot during that campaign that we ran, and I don't know how it happened. It's not what usually happens at my table, not at all, but the dynamic of the gaming group is so important in defining what happens around the table.
For sure. And it's just, and then it's fun to play with different groups. I'm playing with I have two settled groups, one in Copenhagen, one in my near area here in Denmark, and then I have a group in another larger city in my near area, which I'm not playing so often with. And I have two online groups I play some games with, and there's a lot of different dynamics and hierarchy in that. But I also pick up players that want to play the same games that I do. So it's fun. You recognize that you didn't have the right play group for the game you actually want to play, but you adapted then your play group.
No, I mean I ended up loving it because I saw
you adapted it.
even if they were, we could have sessions where people were really into immersion. They were a little bit emo, I guess you would say. So people were super sad, and even after the session had ended, people were like, a bit low, and but they really enjoyed it, and they wanted that.
Nice.
And and so in the end, I was super happy about it.
That's cool. You adapted it in the game, and from there it's I think the emotional play and much of the immersion is very important when we look at horror and dark fantasy, because it's not escapism as at the 5e Dungeon Dragons kick in the door fantasy for sure. The topic for today is dark fantasy and Symbaroum. Matthias is the code designer and code writer on Symbaroum, so he wants, of course, link into this in this talk. Check out our Facebook page, GM Workshop, the podcast, Discord, and Twitter if you want to interact with us or be on the podcast. Reach out to us so you can give us your GM advice and perspectives on your favorite game. We want to talk about Symbaroum because you are the creator of Symbaroum, with some other Swedish co-creator, with some other crazy Swedish guys and girls. And this is a dark fantasy setting set in a pretty cool and depth setting with a lot of cultures and a lot of aspects in it. So let's take a deep dive in what's dark fantasy is for you, and let's turn it over to the setting in specific.
We can try, but because let's start by asking ourselves, what is dark fantasy then? And okay, for me,
what is dark fantasy?
Yeah, that's the important part for today, at least.
That's the important part.
For me, dark fantasy is, when it is about stories without universal morals. It is fantasy without clear-cut views on good and evil, right and wrong, true and false. That is basically how I would define dark fantasy.
Yes.
Or maybe I'd rather call it serious fantasy, maybe. I don't know. Or as you said earlier, grown-up fantasy. And with that said, I dark fantasy are great for a certain play style. The one that is a little bit more serious, a little bit more mature, maybe. And so, but let's hear, when you posed this question, what were you thinking of when you talked about dark fantasy?
Yeah, the morals is very, very clear cut for me. A pinpoint sake for dark fantasy. It's a little bit more dangerous. It's more less hero-less, and it's more in regards of how we look, more gray areas in more than black and white areas. We can have white and black or good or evil small areas, but 98% of the world is gray, and we can always because we are all humans, or in this we have some other races in this setting, but for most, if you look at our own world, it is dark. We are all humans. We have all the different aspects in a human, and I love that's in a setting like Symbaroum and a lot of other dark fantasy worlds, for sure.
Yeah, when people describe Symbaroum to me as dark fantasy, I always
for sure.
I always question this. Not very much these days, but I did at the beginning, because what are they comparing with? I mean, compared to our world, Symbaroum is a quiet, happy-go-lucky place.
Yeah, it's My Little Pony world.
Yeah. So,
sure.
but this is super interesting and important, I think, and something that we at Free League, Free League is today composed of what once was two different companies, and we have a little bit of differences when it comes to game design and such. But one thing that I believe that we are all very find very important is that our settings does not simplify the concepts of good and evil, or right and wrong, or true or false. And for Symbaroum, we have taken that quite far. So instead of grayscales, you can, when it comes to cultural beings in Symbaroum, including humans, but also elves and goblins and trolls and so on, it is not about grayscale, but about perspectives. So there is good and evil in the world of Symbaroum, but what is good and what is evil is a point of view question. So you have fractions or groups with different viewpoints, meaning that, from the perspective of a certain person, two persons will regard good and evil in very different ways, just like in our world, right?
Yeah. Yes, because it's a point of view. I think it's a great point to say point of view aspects in how to see the world. Because if you look at our world, a Trump supporter might see Denmark and Sweden as evil socialists, and we see Trump supporters like bigots and capitalist assholes. So it's fun to see these aspects, and if you use this in a dark fantasy world or a fantasy world or in role playing, you have so many opportunities to create great conflicts, and not conflicts that are violent, but cultural conflicts, and that's where Symbaroum and dark fantasy really excels for me for the most part.
And the cool thing is that whatever the player characters do, however they act, their actions will align with some and clash with others.
Yes.
So in other words, without being very interested in, morals or political role play or intrigue, they will become involved in the world's conflicts because they cannot avoid it. They will inevitably make friends and make enemies because you have these kinds of positions in the in the social structure of the social playing field, you can say. Even
Let's keep on the point of view thing, because later in our deep dive in Symbaroum, which will touch on religion, and that's one of my key things in when I'm playing the dark fantasy in both in Warhammer Roleplay or my own setting and Symbaroum and so on, because it's very, very important to use these point of views that are so clear cut as religion are, because they are built on power struggles, power structures that are not movable for humans at all, or in other races for that matter. When you play dark fantasy, the hero's journey in fantasy are a bit harder to do because of sometimes the deadliness, as in Draga and Demona, Dragons and Demons.
But is it fair to describe the player characters in dark fantasy worlds as heroes?
No, but in fantasy, the normal term in the genre is the hero's journey.
Yeah.
So when we combine it with dark fantasy, the fun and stuff goes away from the hero's journey and just becomes a journey for a person. It's
and I mean, especially I can't talk for all the settings that people call dark fantasy. No. I've heard people describe Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as dark fantasy, and it is in some senses, maybe not so much in others.
Yeah, some sense, yeah.
But in Symbaroum, the hero or protagonists, the player characters, will always have reason to second guess both their motives and their actions.
For sure.
And a hero doesn't do that.
No.
By definition. A Dungeons and Dragons hero doesn't wonder if it was correct, morally right to slay that dragon. No. They just don't.
Because it was red and it's chaotic evil.
Yeah.
Of course. So it's on the stat block. It's evil. Because and that's a great point, Matthias. Because hero's journey is the protagonist journey in this genre, in this corner of fantasy role playing for sure. And Warhammer Roleplay is, especially the first and second edition, are dark fantasy. Then from there it becomes more meh. more boring for sure.
I mean, there's a very distinct good and evil, but then again, among humans, it is kind of grayscale. So I don't know. Let's leave that for the scholars to decide. Sure. The role-playing game scholars.
Cool. No, you won't get any XP.
Fantasy settings also has a lot of magic and the aspects in low fantasy, high magic. How do you handle this schism in Symbaroum especially, but in general when creating a great dark fantasy mood more than a setting?
This is I don't know if I'm schooled enough in role-playing games theory to really answer this. But
let's try.
if we say that high fantasy is this kind of more heroic fantasy, while low fantasy is more close to home, so to speak, I would say that Symbaroum, there are maybe some high fantasy elements to it, but and this is what is important, and I think we will discuss this even more in a little bit. The conflicts plaguing the setting of Symbaroum, or characterizing the setting of Symbaroum, is not epic or otherworldly. They are very well known to all of us who inhabit this world. And actually, I would argue that the conflicts of the setting are what mainly defines it as an arena for role-playing games.
For sure, the culture battles, or the religions, or the Exodus and so on. When you look at Symbaroum, there's a lot of high fantasy elements, like different kind of monsters, some races, both player races and not so much player races to build up. And often these are antagonists or some kind of monsters the creatures can meet in the great forest of Davokar. And you also put in the Davokar forest, you have the elves, so you have some Tolkien fantasy as well in some regards. But still you have this very very tight constructed human civilization core, where we have a strong church which are suppressing both magic and the fantasy elements in, and this I think is a great tool to create a better dark fantasy setting when we have a strict structure that will minimize the fantasy elements, because when we have fantasy elements and spells and special abilities and so on, the tropes will be more fun tuned and not so much a great engine to create the great stories. So I'm leaning towards to use less fantasy when I'm playing dark fantasy, if you can understand.
No, and I think I know what you're getting at, but to us, these tropes or archetypes of high fantasy, when you put them into the setting of Symbaroum with its, and especially when you align them in the structure regarding the main conflict of the game, they become something different. I mean, they may look a bit like Tolkien's elves.
Yeah.
But anyone who has played Symbaroum know that they are something very different. Yes. Because in Symbaroum they are the representatives or the embodiment of one of the extremes in an extreme pool in the main conflict of the game. And many have reacted on the fact that, in Symbaroum the elves play the role that is usually in many role-playing games, fantasy role-playing games, played by the orc, the default enemy.
Yes.
And this is not by chance. This is because we chose the elven archetype of or trope to represent a very important position in the social setting.
Yes.
That is Symbaroum.
Yeah, and that's.
I don't know. Now I'm starting to lose myself in technicalities here. The main thing that is super cool.
Yeah.
It's super cool.
It is. I love the elves as you created them, for sure, and you dodge one of the tropes that are in fantasy by morphing the orc barbarian antagonist race with the classic good guy race elves, and I love that morphing you have created and put a lot of flavor and a lot of depth in.
But still, I mean, the main conflict of Symbaroum. Let's rip off that band-aid. The main conflict of Symbaroum, or the theme that runs through hopefully everything from rules to setting, is the conflict between civilization and nature. And what happens. Let's imagine that nature could respond to humans' will to cultivate and catalog and exploit nature. And what happens then? So you have on the one hand, you talked about the Exodus. You have the Ambrian civilization that has to flee their homeland and comes to this new promised land, as they call it,
Yes.
where the elves of the Iron Pact already live, and they are not super happy when the civilized humans come clumping in with their iron boots and start rooting in the ruins of old. And there you have sort of the main theme of the game, and the elves from other sources, not least from Tolkien, but also from folklore and whatnot.
Yes.
We know the elves as protectors of nature.
Mm-hmm.
So in some sense, given the conflict of this game, it makes very much sense that the elves are opposed to the civilized humans. Right. So maybe we are using a trope, but
You are
not the Tolkien one.
No, you're turning around a lot of tropes in this setting, and I will dive in that to a moment. And that's one of the reasons this setting is so cool. It's the same way as Dark Sun also does it when using tropes and putting that spin on all the tropes for sure. Another.
No, that's one of our missions, I would say, or at least me as lead writer of the campaign, is to shake things up, have people gasp for breath when they realize that what they thought was one way is something totally different.
For sure. Well, we have dived into the setting a bit now, so let's talk about the setting, because Symbaroum is primarily surrounded right around a countryside between a great empire and a huge forest, and the players often play adventurers that will move into Davaka Forest and to find creatures and monsters, and therefrom try to interact with the two big communities in the setting, and try to lean on politics and get missions and so on. That's the first set of in a Symbaroum way to play. But then we can move from that to explain why this setting is so unique in so many aspects. So first, the Exodus of the Ambrians. Can you tell us about this and why this choice? I've touched on it in our outline to take to like the Moses reference from the Bible almost. Have you thought about this this question?
No, the Ambrian people, as we touched upon earlier, they come from a realm called Alberetor, and this Alberetor has been devastated by a 2 decades long war against something that the people of Alberetor refer to as the Dark Lords. Basically, at least if you are to believe the stories, they are more or less your classic necromantic, necromancers. And since the land is no longer fruitful, it doesn't, you can't grow anything, and this earth disease is spreading, people, they had to relocate, and they move north across a mountain range called the Titans, and end up in what becomes their new homeland, Ambria. What we wanted to, I should be a little bit cautious to say what we wanted, because sometimes stories just fall into place.
Yes.
So let's talk about what this Exodus or this start of the settings story, what it does. It makes, because we have the Ambrians recently arrived to this region, and they are representatives of civilization. They are they personify the principle of civilization in some sense, and they are
the Catholic Church almost. They have.
We can talk a little bit more about the church in a while, but that's kind of true. In any way, they are disciplined. They are schooled in the art of war, and they have developed a highly differentiated society that still bears some marks of the old feudal system. But when they come into this land, they almost immediately they are set on conquering it. They don't come as refugees, they come as conquerors. And that it doesn't fare well with the people already living in the region. The humans divided into a number of clans. Called Barbarian Clans by the Ambrians, of course.
By the Ambrians, yes. That's very important to notify.
That's important, yeah.
Yes.
So when we talk about them, we talk about clan folks, but when the Ambrians talk about them, they say barbarians. Yes. So, and then you also have the elves. And the interesting thing with the Exodus, and that it happened just recently, is that the conflict is still new. It has settled a bit on the lowlands, but the conflict between humans and elves is far from settled. And there are also a lot of clan folks that have a hard time coping with these Ambrians because they know no bounds. If they want to harvest wood from an area and they are, frightened away by elven arrows, they come back doubled in strength and with full plate armor. They don't joke around, and the fact that the Ambrians the clan folks and the elves claim that there's an ancient evil lurking here, dormant under the root and moss of Davokar. If you come clamping here, it will awaken. And it will destroy everything. And what do the Ambrians say about that? They say that's just fairy tales meant to try to scare us to, they just want their resources for themselves.
Yes, that's referring back to what I talked about in the beginning with dark fantasy.
Yeah.
Lower the fantasy level in the narrative so you can use fantasy as a horror element or a aspect as in a setting that is not so explicit, and that's a very important thing. So the Exodus of the Ambrians was like Moses in the Bible, but also like the conquistadors from Spain, a wide combination of those two historic elements in our real world. I don't know if the Moses story is historical, but it's in the Bible.
Oh yeah,
it's a fine fantasy Roman novel. It's a fine fantasy novel.
No, I mean you also have the Romans in. Going, trying to spread their influence around the world, conquering here and there. And
for sure.
So there are so many stories that start the same way, and even if the Ambrians themselves would never, or most Ambrians would never describe themselves as conquerors. They are refugees. It's poor us. We just want to have land where we can grow food and whatever.
And so it's a combination between a exodus and a conquering mission for the Ambrians, and that's creates a lot of cool aspects in the cultural wars against the clans, because it's not good or evil as we touched on before. It's actually those poor fugitives from a land, and now they have to have lands to live and grow food and so on. So they are. But when they have been settled in the area, they begin to conquer, and then the conflicts between the elves and the clansmen are beginning. So
and it's also, when you look, you talked about treasure hunting earlier, and that is sort of one of the default type of adventures that you would play in Symbaroum. And looking at the fortune hunters or treasure hunters, many of them are venturing out into Davokar because that's their only choice. They have no other means of survival. They don't have land, they don't have work, maybe, or so their only chance to avoid poverty is going out into that forest, braving the facing the threat of the elves and hoping to find some partly untouched ruin where they can find some small things to bring back home and sell at the markets.
Yeah. And then we're back to the POV as the point of view.
Yeah.
At that the forest are the evil unknown stuff, and the elves are the evil monsters that would kill us in the
they eat children.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
of course they do. And that's the point of view, and the other point of view is the clansmen and the elves, that these people please fuck off, go back behind your mountain and deal with your own problems, and we will kill you, those stupid people that goes into our forest and try to pillage our sacred ruins and sacred burial rites and so on. So I think it's great. It's a great setting for conflict and most protagonists and antagonists are best when they have a great reason to be in the conflict. If you look at movies, it's like the Marvel movies. It wouldn't be anything without Thanos, because we understand his reasoning behind. He wants to decimate the whole universe, but if we don't acknowledge it, it's as particularly smart or nice of him. But we understand why he's from that position for sure. So it's fine to have these things in mind.
Coupled with that, because that's super important. The reason, the incentives for people to fight for what they believe is right. Another thing which is super important in the same context is that virtually no one, not even the wild animals or beasts in the forest of Davokar, are willing to take unnecessary risks.
No.
So if you are 2 weeks into beyond the border of Davokar forest, you really think not twice but 3 times or 4 times before going into a fight. And that is also true for beasts. I mean, if they don't have a reason to fight, they run.
Yeah.
And that is also what the player characters you do quite often in Symbaroum.
Yeah, for sure.
They don't always, but yeah.
It's great.
I try to find other ways to deal with the situation.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's when we look at the setting in some sociological term, because we both have academic backgrounds and we want to see why a setting is great. I often look at what drives the different fractions in the setting, and how can I use these as a GM to make great stories for our players. And we have the Ordo magic, the magic academy, the church, and then the rulers of this society, the Ambrians, the nobles of Ambrians.
The nobles.
And then we have these a lot of these clans, which are in some way allied with the Ambrians in different scales, and some of them are in tough infights against them, and so we have a lot of very subtle cultural aspects to put our players into and make them bounce around in these arenas for sure. So what did you have focus on when you created this game? Was it to have a lot of fractions, or how do you construct this, and where did you start?
Yeah, where did I start? I can honestly say that we started with the main conflict, and then we started based on that conflict, what kind of positions appear. The 3 main positions being either you are an advocate for civilization, you're an advocate for nature, or you are an advocate for a position trying to find balance between the two. So there you have the three main positions, and then on the one side you have the Ambrians for civilization, the elves, and in the middle the clan folks, and especially the witches circle, which is adamant to try to find balance between the between civilization and nature, simply put. So, but then to find a little bit more nuance, you see in let's start with the elves. You have two main positions. All members of the Iron Pact are adamant about defending creation from human or cultural beings misuse and exploitment, but they don't have the same means necessary doing that. There are some who claim that diplomacy is the only right way, and so you have, for instance, an elven emissary in the capital city of Yndaros. Then there are those who have more or less given up hope on the humans being possible to talk to, and they have put on their harnesses and their bows and are on the warpath, more or less. So and on the other side, you talked earlier about Ordo Magica, which is the basically academia in, right? It's academics but some of them are wizards.
Sure. It's a universities.
And then you have the Sun Church with its theurge, and inside the Sun Church, and those who have, this is something that is further developed in the big adventure chronicle, The Throne of Thorns, but you will see a schism starting to appear inside. You can glimpse it in the core book as well, but it's mainly in the first episode in the chronicle that it becomes clear that there is a quite wide schism inside the Sun Church between more or less dogmatic. You talked about Catholicism earlier, and that's certainly fair to one point. A lot of the aesthetics of Sun Church can be recognized from Catholicism, but the church is sort of the most evident organization when it comes to representing civilization, because what do they say? They say that God is dying. And why? Yeah, it is because humans have failed in their God-given task to cultivate the creation of the God, namely nature. So the God Prios, as he's called, he can be saved, but only if humans work harder, extract more crops from the soil, harvest more and richer resources from the woods and mountains, and colonize more of the wilds. So there you have, the priests are preaching exactly what the elves really can't stand.
They're putting on a narrative to create more conflict, and when you create more conflict as a power hold as this church are, you can absorb more followers, and you can create, when you have challenged the one problem, in this case the nature and the elves, when you have conquered this, you can challenge the others in a vacuum, and can you move forward to be the foremost powerful fraction, for sure. And I love the power struggles between inside the Ambrian culture alone, and then we have the culture's structure in the tribes, and again, as you said, the power struggles within the elves as well. So there's a lot of fractions within the fractions within the fractions. And I encourage you.
No, but in the end, it is made up of, you know, we don't need to go into this too deeply, but if you follow that line of thought, you will find that not every sun priest are super friendly with each other. They have their power struggles. Maybe not. They may share the same view on Prios and the same view on what is, you know, the human agenda or whatever, but they may fight over positions within the church. They may fight over, I don't know. They are human, right? So they can, one of them don't like the other one's demeanor and it's just scornful towards him. And there's, you know, people are people even in fantastical settings. And I think it's super important that when we present NPCs in adventures and even in the core books and such, it is super important for us to never introduce them as clear-cut, undisputed members of the canon of their fraction. They will feel slightly different. They will have ambitions of their own. I mean, if you go around in Thistlehold listening to what people say about elves, you will definitely think that they have fangs and they eat their victims and whatnot. But then you meet an elf, and of course, no fangs and eating a carrot, whatever.
They're vegan.
So yeah. So no, I don't think they are, but not necessarily. But in any case, it's, I mean, introducing the world in terms of preconceptions, or, you know, the surface. What are the preconception of the ordinary people in this world? Also makes it possible to break those preconceptions, to shatter them, to deconstruct them completely. And that will hopefully, and now I sound totally pretentious, but hopefully this is something that we can carry along into real world as well.
Oh, yes.
You know, being a little bit more open-minded and not judge people based on what kind of book cover they are clothed in, or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. It's
yeah.
It's some of the things we try to use role-playing for sure. When we put it into our real world, I'm often play scenarios in my real world, and I've often used the term social horror or sociological horror when we're using racism or homophobic terms to convey a setting's structure, if the players are okay with this, of course. But making these it's not the monster in the corner, it's the bigot Trump supporter or something like that. That's the horror in the scene, because we know as people in 2022, these people exist. So this is much more scarier than a monster in the corner. And if we collide this into a fantasy setting, we can touch on this for sure, because some of the races in this setting, we have the human, and we have the changeling, ogre, and goblin in the core book. And we see the changeling, ogre, and goblin as races from because they have physical attributes that are not the same as humans, so they are easy to see past that. These are not humans. But then we have the humans like the clansmen, or the barbarians, as we call them if we are Ambrians. How do we handle this around the table? Should we just shrug on your shoulders, or should we talk about how to use the racism in this setting?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, racism is definitely a thing in the game world. among the cultural beings that lives in the game world. And there is also a rules element that is called you can be either privileged in the setting, or you can be a pariah. And this is basically the only rules mechanism there is for defining social standing. And this is often linked to, goblins and ogres in particular they are often have this trait that's called pariah. So on a general level, there is certainly, some racism in the society of Ambria, and also among the clan folks and among the elves. And it is clearly based on fear, on ignorance, or it can also be fueled by agendas. I mean, the humans of Thistlehold are super happy to look down on the goblins, because the goblins do such a great job, swabbing the streets and cleaning the chimneys and whatnot they do in Thistlehold. But as I said before, I think the way you handle this as a designer or as a GM is that you introduce elements and individuals that break with this general idea of what an elf, a goblin, or troll, or indeed a human is. And you can do that in many different ways. The most important thing I think is that you try to design or portray individual NPCs as individuals, and not as, spokespersons for a race or a faction or whatever.
For sure, because when I played Symbaroum, my two players were only humans, so it was and both Ambrians, because it was a short campaign, so we have to make a very tight frame in what we should do. But we talked about how to play changeling and ogres and goblins, because when we play these, how much weight as a GM should I put on the racism for especially goblins, because they are very low in the society, like in caste systems terms, like Indian caste system. They are very low in the system. We talked about how we could play this without being sad and look at our own world to see how people use racism to uphold their own power and so on. So when you have player characters choosing to play these three other races in changeling, ogre, or goblin, how can we manage this, and so both talk to the players, of course, how much can I lean on you on racism, how much is okay for you, that's one case, but also the other players should also have some saying in how much racism they want to get let out on the table.
Yeah, I think that again depends on, as I said before, when you release a game to a wide audience, that game will become something different at almost every gaming table. And I myself and my friends, I don't see us ever. The trait pariah, which is basically it makes it harder for you to negotiate or come to terms with people of nobility, or the people that are dominant in your society. So I guess that trait pariah, that would come into play if the group of the party try to negotiate a deal on a set of swords, or they try to talk to a baron or whatever. But at our table, I don't see that coming into play in any other way, really. Yeah, so that's probably a super important discussion for, I mean, if you as a GM find but if you find this super interesting to explore in an adventure or a mini campaign or whatever, definitely important to deal with at a session 0, I would say. because it definitely can be sensitive, or I mean, it is.
When we look
Yeah.
at the settings, parameters, and the conflict, as we talked about, touching on before, it's the conquering and colonization aspects of the game. And in some part of the world, this is very, very a hot potato. I'm talking to Liam from the Modern Blood podcast, and he is a Symbaroum fan extraordinaire, and for sure.
Oh yeah.
He loved the game, but he is from New Zealand, and there's been a lot of controversy with conquering and colonization in that area for sure. The native people in those part of the world have been not well treated for lack of words. So can you see the aspect of this game? It's also something we have to recognize and talk about, or is it only when the players has history surrounding it, or can we talk about this and use role-playing game?
I mean, it's there. It's definitely there. And I've actually talked
Nice.
to Liam about it.
Nice.
So, but I see it like this, that the setting of Symbaroum is very much described, if you look at the core book, from the perspective of the Ambrians. Since it is expected the most player characters will be Ambrians, at least initially. But again, that doesn't mean that the Ambrians are portrayed as just or as righteous, that they are the good guys fighting against evil. And that is something that I hope and trust will shine through when the game is played. I know of many gaming groups where the player characters actively oppose Ambria. They are from Ambria, but they learn from the witches or from the elves or whatever, and they start taking an active stance against Ambria and its colonial and other ambitions. So, and for me, it's important that the games, for me to enjoy a game, it is important that it deals with stuff that I can relate to in some fashion, and relate to my life as a human being in this world. But I really don't necessarily want the games to tell me what to think about those issues. So, and again, I mean, if like any artifact, cultural artifact, the role-playing games must be, it must be looked as a cultural artifact, and maybe that the conflicts that interest me and that I find important to discuss or whatever, they have a different meaning in somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in time. And if so, the people, sitting down with that book at their table, they should definitely have a discussion about it. I mean, for me, it's quite easy because it's so obvious for me that I'm on the wrong side of that story, or not me personally, but my heritage or my, Sweden has a long and very illustrious history of trying to conquer and actually succeeding to conquer a huge part of Europe. And
Denmark.
For instance, Denmark was not bad. They like to conquer parts of Sweden. So, exactly. No, and so for me, it's obvious that I'm on the bad side of this, and that makes it interesting for me, not only for me personally, but I think that this is something that is worth, that people should think about. And the game will never glorify it or never portray it as something that is
this is
you
the
know.
right way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Then it's important. I think it's important because, as we said before, the sociological horror elements in what conquering and colonization is very good tool to create great conflicts and stories for sure. When we're moving on to religion, we had touched on it before. The point of view that religion often the religion often creates the narrative for what mysticism is and what the evil is in the society. It does it in our world and still does it in our world. So in this and you in Symbaroum setting, you are doing this the perfect way as in my aspects, because I love the way you are using religion as a antagonist for most parts, and using the silliness in religious structures to define what is good and what is evil, and that's I will apply that for, of course, for you, because I like the problem with religion in fantasy settings is that it's defined by who can use spells in which level. And those that have the more levels, they have the truth or are more connected to God or something like that. And that is not the case in this setting and this religion. There's a lot of power hungry guys and girls in this in this setting that are not very good in doing godly divine magic for so much. How do you use this and use the point of view from religion as a dark fantasy element and a horror element in society?
So I'm going to assume now that most people listening to this are GMs. So, and I'm going to spoil a little bit about because Symbaroum has been, as me and the team that designed Symbaroum, we almost exclusively design games for the purpose of telling a grand epic story. And in the case of Symbaroum, that grand epic story is called The Throne of Thorns, and it's a 6-part adventure campaign. I'm currently writing the final one. The church is very much at the center of what is happening throughout the campaign. And the church, it goes through a sort of a reformation, you can say. And the player characters will be able to be part in this, either as advocates for or against the Reformation, and they will also have the possibility to uncover a lot of truths about the clergy and the clergy's relationship to the crown. So that said, and this is how I always. What is interesting about the giver of laws, Krios, as he's called, the sun god. He's got many names. Is that if you look at what the priests and theurgs say and their preachings, you could from a distance very much suspect that they are they are speaking the voice of the nobility, of the monarchy, the crown, because what they are saying is basically work harder, and then in parentheses, work harder to put more delicious food on our tables. They say extract more crops from the soil. Yeah, you lazy bums out there and work. Harvest more rich resources from the woods and mountains. And then they add, or else God will die and all will turn to darkness. So you have the church as very much as an instrument of power for the haves to use against the have-nots.
Yeah, and we have this, and the church has this great story behind them, that they can point at the Ambrian Exodus, and this is what happened when we are not working this hard, and so they can put a lot of strings into the backstory in the setting.
Yeah,
and it's just perfect design for your case, of course. Well, that's a failure. The church as a whole, there's a magic relation to this. There is clerics that can use magic on the backside of this god. How do you explain this in the setting for not taking high fantasy elements out of the equation and putting in, telling this is real, the god is real, it's not a faith, the god is real. How do you understand this?
No, I mean, of course, the priests. I don't know that all priests necessarily believe that Prios exists, but they do all claim that it does. And as for this power of this mystical tradition of the church, which is called theurgy, I mean, it's they claim that the power they are using comes from Prios.
Yes.
But there's no real evidence, of course. No, I mean, it could just be that they could be drawing from the same source of creation
and the elves,
as the wizards, and as the wizards, witches,
and
or the troll singers, yes, and death mages, and what the other traditions are called. So and there is not in the core books, and there will never be a supplement going forth that will clearly state to you as a GM if Prios exists or is just a figment of human imagination. Because from our point of view as designers, if you feel the need to decide, then do so. But based on what we aim to create, there is no need to actually decide if Prios exists or not.
And that's a great point, because you do not define where the magic come from, what the miracles and so on.
No.
And I love that part of the setting. It's the same choices I have made in my own dark fantasy world.
There are a lot of theories.
Yes,
I mean, there are in game there are a lot of theories and claims and statements and long bloody philosophical thesis, yes, about the nature of magic, but yeah, that's in-world, and they all contradict one another, so who do you believe?
I'm going a bit of a bound of our outline, but I have a curious question. When you're creating a setting and you're creating a campaign as vast as this, how do you cope with the choices other GMs and other players are screwing with your story and plan? And when you said it have different chapters, you might have a player group or a GM group that looks at the next chapter and see this can't be happening because that happened in chapter 1.
Yeah.
How do you? A classic example is the Enemy Within campaign from Warhammer Roleplay, one of the very iconic setting campaigns, and often I see people try to play it that they haven't even came close to the same outcome I did when I played that back in the days. How do you create this communal campaign setting?
To be honest, I think that's a discussion for our next 1.5 hour session.
Okay, we'll skip it.
Very shortly. I can say that this is one of the things that we really try to do. You should be able to play the parts of the Throne of Thorns campaign with very different incentives and very different goals for different groups. So they are basically designed to be played by a group of characters that love the Queen of Ambria and another group that follow the Iron Pact. What this does is that we have to leave quite a lot of prep in the hands of the game master, and be upfront about that this is I mean, there are also instructions, how to play scene by scene with a mission giver if you want to do the low prep version. But basically, we assume that game masters and gaming groups are ready to put some work into it, to adapt it to their table, because there are no way. I mean, if you bare bone it so much that you write something that can be played without any tweaks or adaptations to your characters and their goals and whatnot, then it is often not very interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
I think.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's great, but we will take that in another episode for sure. I love because I love the dilemmas game designers which are designing settings that are very in depth, like Symbaroum or like Warhammer Roleplay or like a lot of other settings that have so much lore and so on, and then we give it to some players and they just screw it up at the table, and then they will and then
that's role playing.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
sure.
the thing.
Yeah.
The most important thing at the table is player agency.
Yes.
The freedom for the characters to actually go their own way and to handle situations, challenges in what way, best way they see fit. And sometimes they are stupid and they die.
Yeah.
And sometimes they are stupid and just fail.
Yeah.
And sometimes they are smarter and
And
are
die.
lucky enough
Smart,
to prove.
smart and dies.
Yeah, that happens too.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's the role play. The pre-written story isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is the story that emerges based on that. So trying to, facilitate good stories, that is what you can hope to do as a designer of published adventures.
Game design, because it must be a fairly hard balance between writing a book and writing a story, because if you want to write a book or a novel surrounding Symbaroum, it's easy for you. But if you want to include player agency, as you said, or GM, and also GM agency, you have some all over the place issues. So it's at a pretty important point. And
that is super interesting discussion, yes, but I think we save it for next time.
I will hope you okay, we'll take the most. It's a fun question because it's the 11 clans. They have this witchocracy where witches controls some of the clans. Some of the clans are not controlled by witches, but most of them are, and some of them are females or men, and they have mystical powers and have knowledge from the ancient times and the forest and alliance with the elves and so on. I like that structure because you create a power structure or a hierarchy so that are not based on status or which father, which mother have brought you into this world, but merely what do you know and which powers do you absorb through your livelihood. Which thoughts was brought into this kind of power leaders or structure?
I don't know. Sometimes I'm pretty sure that by the time that we designed, I mean, it's about 5 years past since we designed this setting, and if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would probably have given a razor sharp, distinct answer. But sometimes the truth is also that sometimes you and those are often the most interesting things is when you set out to design a world, but you find that you are discovering it instead, because things fall into place.
Yes.
And I believe that because what you're talking about now is there are these 11 clans. They were 12, but the Ambrians more or less annihilated one of them.
Yeah.
Or I think they were 13, and the Ambrians absorbed one clan and annihilated another that lived on the plains.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah, whatever. The clans.
The clans are basically nations of their own, if you like.
Yeah.
But about 500 years ago, they faced the threat of Angatal-Tar, also known as the Spider King, who fought war against the humans. And in response to this, the clans came together and appointed a high chieftain to lead the war against the defense mainly against the Spider King, and that they won the war eventually, and the institution of the high chieftain still exists, but the high chieftain doesn't have any formal right to decide about the internal affairs of the clans. The high chieftain can be asked to arbitrate if two clans don't agree, don't say eye to eye, if they are at war, the high chieftain can come in as an arbitrator, basically. But next to the high chieftain is the Huldra, which is the leader of the clan folks' common witch circle, and that is the thing that you refer to, and they are sort of an informal council consisting of one witch from each of the clans, led by the Huldra, who currently is called Gieleta, and they have a very in-depth knowledge about the forest. And you can think of if you live on, say, on a small island nation or something, knowing about the ocean is currency for influence and power, right?
Yes.
And in this case, knowledge about Davokar is absolutely crucial for the daily lives of the clan members. So the circle of witches with the Huldra, or as the Ambrians call her, the Archwitch, of course.
Yes.
They are advisors to the chieftains, and as you were saying earlier, it's easy. I want to point out, just so that is clear, chieftains are not always male, and witches are not always female. It's not a gender thing. It is two different positions. The position of chieftain is a more worldly power, but they always heed the advice of the witch circle, which is more, have better knowledge of all the clans' situations, while the chieftains only look at their own.
That's great. Great point. I just was just curious about especially the sex, the gender stuff surrounding this structure, and as we touched on before in our pre-interview. So it was pretty cool to elaborate on that for sure, because it's a unique way to construct a power structure in a so vast fraction as the clans are. So it's a pretty cool it's a pretty cool concept.
Yeah.
Again, it's knowledge and not status. Something we could learn about in our own world for sure.
Oh yeah.
So, but again, Matthias, thank you for doing this. And have you anything to reveal for us or elaborate?
No, hopefully by March we will have a Swedish manuscript for the final part in the Throne of Thorns. And it will be the translation will be underway, and we will start with the illustrations and maps and eventually layout and so on. So before the end of the year, at least, I hope that the saga of the Throne of Thorns will come at an end. And I hope, if you haven't already, there is a quick start Symbaroum, very meaty 117 pages Symbaroum quick start that is free to download from our web store and from Drive-Thru RPG. if you are curious about the game, you will find most
Yeah.
of the setting information and some of the rules and so on.
I've actually used that when I played back for a year ago. And Matthias, when we close down now, but in regards to the campaign setting, the campaign you've written, it's how many sessions are designed for?
Oh,
so
that I would say is very much up to the playing style of the gaming group. My good friend and editor for this, Matthias Lilja, who was also the main guy behind the Symbaroum rule set, he plays the campaign together with a group of friends down in Stockholm, far away from where I'm at, and he usually plays each episode in I would say 6 to 7 5-hour sessions. But I am very sure that you could easily end up playing twice that or even 3 times that before you, because every book is it is a meaty adventure in each of the books. So I would, if I played at least 10 sessions per part. So
cool. I was just curious if I want to jump into the campaign and
I count on it.
Thank you to Matthias for diving into the Symbaroum setting with us. Next time we want to talk more Symbaroum. This is with Jacob, who are the co-creator on the 5e version of Symbaroum. So check that out. Follow us on Facebook, GM Workshop, the podcast. If you want to interact with us and talk to us, give us a message.